The December wind screamed across the Montana plains, a beast made of ice and fury. It slammed into Ethan Cole, driving snow into the deep lines of his face. He'd been on the trail for 3 days of bone-deep cold, dreaming of his own empty hearth. But the storm had other plans. Through the swirling white, a fence line appeared. The Lane property, a modest farmhouse, smoke curling from the chimney like a prayer. But something was wrong. Nailed to the gate was a crude sign, the words stark against the wood. For sale. Tom Lane wouldn't sell, not ever. That man had poured his soul into this stubborn patch of dirt. 160 acres of nothing special, except for one thing. Water rights, the rights to Crystal Creek, the only reliable water for 50 miles. And with the railroad coming, water wasn't just life, it was a fortune. Ethan swung down from his horse just as the farmhouse door creaked open. A woman stood there, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She was pale as the snow itself. "Mr. Cole," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. "Martha." Ethan touched the brim of his hat. "Saw the sign. Where's Tom?" Her jaw tightened. Inside, a small face peeked from the window. Annie, their little girl. Martha's eyes filled with a grief so raw it stole the air from Ethan's lungs. But when she spoke, her voice was iron. "Tom passed. Pneumonia. 2 weeks ago." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. Tom Lane, his friend, the man who'd stood with him against rustlers and never asked for a thing in return. Gone. "I'm sorry, Martha." The words felt small, useless. She just nodded, her gaze distant. "Stable your horse. There's coffee." The barn was a mess. Loose boards, hungry-looking livestock. Tom would never have stood for it. The weight of this place was already crushing his widow. In the kitchen, warmth wrapped around him like a blanket. Martha poured coffee. Little Annie sat at the table, drawing with a piece of charcoal. "That's a fine horse," Ethan said, his voice gentle. "It's Papa's horse, Buttercup," the little girl said. "Mr. Crow took her." Martha went stiff. "Annie, go check the chickens for eggs." The child slipped away, leaving a heavy silence behind her. "Silas Crow has been here," Ethan stated. It wasn't a question. "Every day since the funeral," Martha's voice broke. "He holds the note on our loan. He says with Tom gone, it's due in full. Offered me half what the land is worth." Her hands clenched into fists on the tabletop. "If I don't sell by the end of the month, the sheriff forecloses." Ethan knew Silas Crow. A man who smiled while he put a knife in your back. A man who collected debts like other men collected memories. And he wanted those water rights. "The bank won't help," Martha whispered. "I have $17 to my name and a daughter who keeps asking why her papa won't wake up." Ethan stared at the picture on the mantel. Tom and Martha, young and full of hope, holding a baby Annie, a future turned to ash. His own ranch was stable, but it was empty, just a house filled with ghosts. An idea sparked in his mind. Wild, reckless, but it might be the only way. "Martha," he said slowly, "there might be a way. Not charity, a business arrangement." She looked up, her eyes full of a pain he knew all too well. "Marry me." Silence. The only sound was the howling of the wind. Martha's face went from pale to flushed, then back to pale again. "I beg your pardon?" "Hear me out. It's the law. A married woman's property becomes her husband's. Crow can't force a sale without my signature." He leaned forward, his voice urgent. "I pay off the loan. You and Annie keep your home. We become partners. It's the only way to beat him." She stared at him, her mind racing. He could see the war in her eyes, the desperation fighting against the pride. "People will talk. Let them." "Tom's barely in the ground," she whispered, the words like a fresh wound. "Tom would want his family safe." Before she could answer, Annie's small voice cried out from the other room. "Mama, there's a man coming." They both knew who it was. Heavy boots stomped on the porch. "Let me," Ethan said, his voice low and hard. He opened the door. Silas Crow stood there, a smug smile on his face. Two hard-faced men flanking him. "Cole." Crow's smile widened. Didn't expect you. Come to pick the bones or just sniffing around the widow? The lady's not interested, Ethan said, his body blocking the doorway. Crow's eyes glittered with malice. She can speak for herself. She doesn't have to. Ethan didn't move. We have an understanding. The smile on Crow's face vanished. What kind of understanding? The kind that's none of your business? For a long moment, the two men stood locked in a battle of wills. Finally, Crow laughed, a cold, empty sound. 3 days, Mrs. Lane. Then the loan is due. I doubt Mr. Cole's understanding is going to cover it. He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving the threat hanging in the air. Martha was trembling when Ethan shut the door. 3 days, she breathed. Then we move fast. Ethan turned to her, his gray eyes steady. My offer stands, but you have to decide right now. Martha's gaze went to her daughter, who was watching from the stairs with wide, frightened eyes. She thought of Tom. She thought of the land they had bled for. She thought of a future where she had nothing left to lose. All right, she said, her voice barely a whisper. God help us. All right. The wedding was a cold, quiet affair. Just the preacher, two witnesses pulled from the general store, and little Annie watching with solemn eyes. Martha wore a simple gray dress. Ethan stood beside her, his trail coat still damp from the snow. They spoke the vows, their breath fogging in the frigid air of the church. Ethan slid Tom's old wedding band onto her finger. It felt heavy, wrong. It was a contract, nothing more. Back at the farm, Ethan moved into the small spare room downstairs. He worked from dawn until his muscles screamed, trying to beat the broken-down farm back into shape. He was mending the barn roof when he found it, tucked behind a loose rafter, a small leather-bound journal. Tom's journal. He knew he shouldn't. It was a violation, but he opened it anyway. The last entry was dated the day before Tom died. The handwriting was shaky, weak. Fever's worse. Crow was here again. Didn't bring medicine this time. Brought whiskey. Said it would burn the sickness out. Drank some to please him. Tastes strange. Bitter. My chest feels like it's on fire. Ethan's blood ran cold. Pneumonia. That's what the doctor had said. But this was something else. Silas Crow hadn't just watched Tom Lane die. He'd helped him along. Ethan closed the journal, his hands shaking with a rage so pure it burned. This was no longer about a debt. It was about murder. And now he had married the victim's wife. Martha kept her distance. She cooked. She cleaned. She cared for Annie. But she built a wall of silence around herself that Ethan couldn't seem to break. He didn't tell her about the journal. What good would it do? It was his word against a powerful man. He needed proof. Then the fire started. He woke to Annie's screams, the night sky glowing an angry orange. The barn was an inferno. He ran barefoot in the snow, throwing useless buckets of water against a wall of flame. Martha stood on the porch, clutching Annie, her face a mask of horror. As the roof collapsed, sending a shower of sparks into the sky, Ethan saw them. Two figures slipping away into the darkness on horseback. Crow's men. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was a declaration of war. The next day, sifting through the ashes, Ethan found something the fire hadn't completely destroyed. A small, half-melted tin box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a stack of papers. They were letters from a man named Peterson, a surveyor for the railroad. The letters detailed a secret agreement. Silas Crow would acquire the Lane property by any means necessary. In exchange, the railroad would pay him 10 times its value and make him a partner in their new land venture. But it was the last letter that made Ethan's heart stop. The farmer's getting suspicious. He needs to have an accident. Make it look natural. Pneumonia is a common affliction this time of year. There it was. Proof. Silas Crow hadn't just taken Tom's horse or his land. He had taken his life. He showed the letters to Martha. She read them in silence, her face growing paler with each word. When she finished, she looked up at him, her eyes burning with a cold fire. The wall between them was gone. In its place was a shared, terrible purpose. He's not just a thief, she said, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. He's a murderer. And we're going to prove it, Ethan said. But how? Crow owned the sheriff. He had the railroad in his pocket. They were two people against a man who thought he was a king. Tom mentioned a place, Martha said slowly, her mind racing back. A lockbox he kept at the bank in Billings. He said it was for emergencies. Crow would have thought of that, Ethan said. Maybe, our Martha replied. But Tom was clever. He said the key wasn't a key. It was a word. A word only she would know. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. But it was all they had. They had to get to that lockbox. They had to uncover the truth. But they both knew that Silas Crow would do anything to stop them. And he was watching their every move. The trip to Billings was a tense, silent affair. Ethan drove the wagon, his rifle across his lap, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Martha sat beside him, Annie asleep in her arms, her face set with a grim determination. They were being followed. A lone rider, keeping his distance, but always there. One of Crow's men, a shadow sent to make sure they didn't get any ideas. They reached Billings at dusk, the city lights a welcome sight after 2 days on the open prairie. Ethan took a room at a small boarding house, telling the owner they were just passing through. I'll go to the bank in the morning, Martha said once they were alone. It's too dangerous, Ethan argued. Crow's man is out there. He'll be watching. He's watching for you, Martha countered. Not me. I'm just a grieving widow running errands. She was right. It was a risk, but it was their best chance. The next morning, Martha dressed in a simple black dress and veiled hat. She looked like any other woman in mourning. She walked to the bank, her heart pounding with every step. Crow's man was across the street, pretending to read a newspaper. He barely gave her a second glance. Inside the bank, the manager was sympathetic but firm. I'm sorry, Mrs. Lane, but without a key, I can't possibly open Mr. Lane's box. My husband told me the key wasn't a physical object, Martha said, her voice steady. He said it was a word, our daughter's first word. She leaned forward and whispered it. Buttercup. The bank manager's eyebrows shot up. He disappeared into the vault and returned a moment later with a heavy metal box. Inside, Martha found what they were looking for. Not just the deed to the farm, free and clear, but another document, a signed confession. It was from the doctor who had pronounced Tom dead. The confession detailed how Silas Crow had coerced him, threatening his family, forcing him to list pneumonia as the cause of death. But the doctor's conscience had gotten the better of him. He'd written it all down and given it to Tom for safekeeping. Tom had the truth all along. He just hadn't lived long enough to use it. Martha tucked the papers into her dress, her hands trembling with a mixture of triumph and terror. She had the proof. Now she just had to get it out of the city alive. But when she stepped out of the bank, Crow's man was gone. The street was empty, too empty. A carriage pulled up beside her. The door opened. Silas Crow sat inside, a cold smile on his face. Get in, Mrs. Lane. Or should I say, Mrs. Cole. We have some business to discuss. Ethan knew something was wrong. Martha should have been back an hour ago. He left Annie with the landlady and went looking for her. He found the bank manager pale and shaken. She left with the box, he stammered. Then a man in a fine carriage. Ethan didn't need to hear the rest. He ran to the livery, saddled his horse, and tore out of the city, pushing his mount harder than he ever had before. He knew where Crow would take her. There was an old abandoned line shack 20 miles out of town, a place where a man could do terrible things and no one would ever hear the screams. He rode like a madman, the wind tearing at his face, his mind a maelstrom of fear and rage. He had let her go alone. He had let this happen. He found the carriage tracks easily and followed them into the hills. As he neared the shack, he dismounted, creeping the last quarter mile on foot, his rifle in hand. He peeked through a grimy window. Martha was tied to a chair. Crow stood over her, the confession in his hand. You and your husband have been a thorn in my side for too long, Crow was saying, but it ends tonight. This document will burn, and you, my dear, will have a tragic accident, just like your first husband. He laughed, tossing the paper into the fireplace. But Martha wasn't crying. She was looking past him at the window, a faint, desperate hope in her eyes. That was all Ethan needed to see. He kicked the door in, his rifle already at his shoulder. Crow spun around, surprise and rage on his face. his hand diving for his gun, but he was too slow. Ethan's first shot took him in the chest, throwing him back against the wall. His second shot was for Tom Lane. Crow slid to the floor, his eyes wide with disbelief, the confession turning to ash in the fireplace beside him. Silence. Ethan rushed to Martha, cutting her free. She collapsed into his arms, sobbing, not with fear, but with relief. "It's over," he whispered, his hand stroking her hair. "It's finally over." They rode back to Billings under a sky full of stars. The confession was gone, but it didn't matter. Silas Crow was dead. The threat was over. They had justice. When they returned to the farm, the community was waiting. They had heard what happened. They had come to stand with the man and woman who had fought for their home and won. Months later, as the first snows of a new winter began to fall, Martha stood on the porch, watching Annie play in the yard. Ethan came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "The railroad's coming through next spring," he said quietly. "They want to buy the water rights." Martha leaned back against him, a soft smile on her face. "What should we tell them?" "I think," Ethan said, kissing the top of her head, "we'll tell them we're not selling." This land wasn't just about money anymore. It was about legacy. It was about a promise kept to a dead friend. It was about the family they had built from the ashes of grief and despair. Ethan and Martha faced down a killer and a corrupt system to protect their family and their home. Their story reminds us that sometimes the greatest strength is found not in fighting alone, but in finding someone to fight alongside. What do you think? Was Ethan's marriage proposal a reckless gamble or an act of true loyalty? Let us know in the comments below. And if their story of courage and unexpected love captured your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more tales from the wild and untamed West. Thanks for watching. The sun was a hammer over the Wyoming prairie, beating the land into a cracked, dusty wasteland. Jacob Thornton stood on his porch, staring at the brittle grass where his cattle were slowly starving. The drought had taken everything. His ranch was a skeleton, his hope a ghost. In his hand, he held a letter. Not a love letter, a letter of desperation. 6 weeks ago, he'd sent it to a matrimonial agency in St. Louis. His request was simple. He didn't want a young bride. He didn't want a beautiful one. He just wanted a woman of solid character, someone plain, someone who could share the backbreaking work and the crushing loneliness. He wanted a partner, not a temptation. The part of his heart that could feel love was buried with his wife, Martha, 3 years ago. But a telegram came 2 days earlier. Bride arriving Tuesday, noon train. That was today. As Jacob hitched the horses, he felt a knot of dread tighten in his gut. He was a man riding toward a future he had ordered, but couldn't possibly imagine. Willow Creek was a town built on dust and whispers. By the time Jacob's wagon rolled down Main Street, everyone knew. Curtains twitched in windows. Men stopped to stare. Women whispered behind their hands. The hermit was getting a mail-order bride. Their eyes felt like tiny needles on the back of his neck as he stepped onto the station platform. The whole town had turned out for the show. Then the train's whistle screamed. Black smoke billowed on the horizon. The locomotive roared into the station, hissing steam and grinding steel. Passengers stepped onto the platform. Jacob scanned their faces, looking for the plain, sturdy woman he expected. Then he saw her. She stood in the doorway of the passenger car, and the entire world went silent. Her hair was the color of spun gold. Her dress was simple, but it couldn't hide the grace in the way she stood. And her face was a work of art, with eyes the color of warm honey. A hush fell over the platform. Someone whispered, "Good Lord." This wasn't the woman he had asked for. This wasn't a plain partner to share his burdens. This was beauty itself, the one thing he had prayed to avoid. In that single heart-stopping moment, Jacob Thornton's carefully buried heart began to beat again, and it terrified him. "Mr. Thornton?" Her voice was as clear and steady as a mountain stream. "I am Emma Foster." Jacob could only nod. He reached for her trunk, and when their hands brushed, a jolt of electricity shot up his arm. The whispers from the crowd grew louder. "She can't be for him. She must be running from something." Emma ignored them, her chin held high. She walked beside him, a queen moving through a crowd of peasants. As they rode out of town, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling of dread. He had asked for a quiet life, a safe life. But the woman beside him was a spark in a tinder, dry world. She was the kind of beautiful that started fires, the kind that got men killed, and she was his. The ride to the ranch was long and silent. The prairie was a sea of dust, shimmering under the brutal sun. Emma sat beside him, perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. Her composure was unnerving. She should have been a comfort. Instead, her beauty was a constant, burning reminder of everything he had lost and everything he was terrified to feel again. "There it is," he said finally, his voice rough as the small, weathered homestead came into view. Emma looked at the sagging barn, the dusty garden, the lonely house leaning against the wind. "It's very peaceful," she said. "It's lonely," he corrected. Her honey-colored eyes met his. "Sometimes lonely is what a person needs." The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. She saw too much. She understood things he had never spoken aloud. He led her to the small spare room that would be hers. "It isn't much," he said. "It will do." She didn't complain. She walked the property, her sharp eyes taking everything in. She ran the dry soil of the garden through her fingers. "The ground isn't dead," she said, her voice soft but sure. "It's just thirsty." Jacob stared at her. He had asked for a plain woman, a workhorse. He had gotten a poet, a woman who saw life where he saw only dust and decay. That night she moved through his kitchen as if she'd been there her whole life. The smell of biscuits filled the small house, a scent he hadn't smelled in years. He sat at the table, trying to focus on mending a bridle, but his eyes kept finding her. The lamplight turned her hair to a golden halo. Every move she made was a fresh torment. "We should be clear about arrangements," he said after their silent supper. "This is a business arrangement. You'll have your room, I'll have mine. I won't require more than that." "That suits me," she said, her expression unreadable. "I did not come here seeking tenderness, Mr. Thornton." He should have been relieved. Instead, a strange, sharp disappointment pierced through him. This was going to be harder than he thought. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Emma worked from sunup to sundown, hauling water, scrubbing floors, her presence a constant, silent challenge to his solitude. The drought worsened. The well began to spit mud. The cattle grew thin, their cries haunting the night. Then the wolves came. He found their tracks near the pasture one evening. "We'll need to stand watch," he told her. Her response was simple. "I can shoot." And she could. When the wolves attacked near dawn, it was Emma's shot that dropped the pack leader. Jacob rushed out to join her, and they stood side by side, their rifles barking in the twilight, driving the rest of the pack back into the hills. As the sun rose, they stood over the dead wolf, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the cold air. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked. Her gaze was distant. "When you have something worth protecting, you learn." He had seen her beauty. Now he was seeing her strength, and that combination was a danger he had no defense against. Weeks later, with the well almost dry, Emma found water. She had insisted on digging near a stand of cottonwoods, claiming the trees couldn't survive without a deep source. He had thought she was crazy, but as they sat by the new well, covered in sweat and dirt, watching the precious water seep into the hole, he found himself leaning toward her, drawn by something more powerful than thirst. A coyote howled in the distance, and the moment was broken. That night, the air in the small house was thick with unspoken words, with a desire that both of them were desperately trying to fight. Then the rain came, the first real storm in months. Emma ran outside laughing, her face turned up to the sky. She spun in the downpour, her thin dress clinging to her body, her hair streaming like liquid gold. Jacob watched from the porch, his heart aching with a feeling he refused to name. When a crack of lightning sent them scrambling back inside, dripping and breathless, he wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. She looked up at him, her eyes shining, and the world seemed to stop. "I should tell you why I came," she whispered, and the story spilled out. A story of her father's debts, and of a cruel, wealthy man who had bought her, who saw her as nothing more than a beautiful possession to be owned. "She had run," answered Jacob's ad, hoping a man who wanted a plain wife wouldn't see her as a prize. Jacob's hands clenched into fists. He had wanted to be safe from beauty and its complications. But Emma's beauty wasn't a prize. It was a curse, a danger that had followed her all the way to his door. "You're not safe here," he said, his voice hoarse. "Not anymore." Her breath trembled. "And yet, I feel safer with you than I ever have." Before he could answer, another sound cut through the storm. The sound of hoofbeats, fast, approaching. The past had arrived. The rider was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. His name was Charles Whitman, and he wore his wealth like armor. He sat on his fine black horse, a cruel smile playing on his lips, and looked at Jacob as if he were something he'd scraped off his boot. "I believe you have something that belongs to me," Whitman said, his cold eyes flicking to Emma, who stood frozen in the doorway. "She's my wife," Jacob said, stepping in front of her. "Any claim you have is void." Whitman laughed. "Wife? I checked. There are no papers filed, no vows spoken, just two people living in sin." I do. His gaze crawled over Emma, possessive and ugly. "I have a contract signed by her father. She's mine, Thornton. I'll be back with the law to collect my property." He rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and the stench of his threat hanging in the air. Emma collapsed, her face white with terror. "You don't know him," she whispered. "He'll destroy this place. He'll destroy you." Jacob pulled her to her feet, his hands gentle on her arms. "Let him try." The next day, Whitman returned, just as he'd promised. He brought the sheriff and the judge with him. He flourished the contract, a legal document that treated Emma like livestock, payment for her father's gambling debts. The town of Willow Creek watched, hungry for the drama. "The contract is legal," the judge said, his face grim. "She belongs to Mr. Whitman." "How much?" Jacob's voice was a low growl. Whitman smirked. $25,000. "With interest?" A gasp went through the crowd. It was an impossible sum, a king's ransom. "Then we settle it another way," Jacob said, his hand dropping to rest on the butt of his Colt. "You and me. Winner takes all." A duel, the oldest, most brutal law of the West. Whitman's smile was predatory. "I've killed 7 men. I'll enjoy making you the 8th." They met on Main Street at high noon. The town was silent, holding its breath. Emma stood in the crowd, her face pale, her hands clasped in a prayer. The sheriff dropped a white handkerchief. Whitman's draw was a blur of motion. His gun barked, the bullet screaming past Jacob's ear. But Jacob was a half-second slower, a lifetime steadier. He didn't aim for the heart. He aimed for the shoulder. His bullet struck true, spinning Whitman around and slamming him into the dust. The crowd erupted. Whitman lay on the ground, his fine suit stained with blood and dirt, his face twisted in a mask of pain and disbelief. "Finish it," he gasped. Jacob walked toward him, his revolver leveled. He stood over the man who had tried to buy his wife, who had threatened to destroy his life. He could end it all, right here, right now. Instead, he holstered his weapon. "You'll live," Jacob said, his voice cold as ice. "But you'll leave. And if you ever come near her again, I won't miss." He then pulled a folded paper from his own pocket. A marriage certificate signed by the Reverend an hour earlier. "She's my wife, legally. You've lost." Whitman's face contorted with rage, but he was a beaten man and everyone knew it. He stumbled to his horse and rode out of Willow Creek, a ghost of a man, his power broken. That night, Jacob held Emma in his arms, the storm outside a distant memory. "I spent 3 years thinking my heart was dead," he whispered against her hair. "But then you came." She looked up at him, her honey-colored eyes shining with tears. "I came here to hide, but I found a home." The ranch was no longer a place of sorrow. It was a place of new beginnings. The well they had dug together gave life to the thirsty garden. The house, once silent and grim, was now filled with the sound of Emma's quiet humming. Jacob, the man who had prayed for a plain wife, had gotten a miracle instead. He had found a love born from desperation, forged in danger, and sealed in a trial by fire. A love that was anything but plain. What do you think is more powerful, a love you choose, or a love that chooses you? Let us know in the comments below. If this story of redemption on the frontier moved you, make sure you hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss the next tale of how love can bloom in the most unexpected and dangerous of places.